The father humiliated his daughter in front of everyone, but the grandfather stood up and said it was time to reveal the truth. What did he reveal, and how did it change everything? Watch it till the end. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. A cold breeze filtered through the grand hallways of the Wells estate, winding its way past the towering portraits that adorned the walls, each a testament to the family's legacy. The house itself was a monument to wealth and tradition, passed down through generations of the Wells bloodline. Yet, within those pristine walls, behind the polished mahogany doors and marble floors, lived a girl who did not belong. Amira Wells had known she was unwanted for as long as she could remember. She had known it in the way her mother looked at her, in the way her father barely acknowledged her presence, and in the way her siblings treated her as if she were an unwelcome guest rather than one of their own. She had known it in the way the household staff, ever loyal to the whims of their employers, would lower their gazes when she entered a room, speaking to her in clipped tones, offering only the most basic courtesies required of them. She had known it in the whispers that followed her everywhere, the ones she pretended not to hear. Her father, James Wells, was a man of industry, the head of Wells Enterprises, a corporation that had built its empire in finance and real estate. He was known for his cold efficiency, his keen ability to spot opportunity, and his ruthless pursuit of perfection. In the eyes of the world, he was a visionary, a man who had taken his family's fortune and multiplied it tenfold. In the eyes of his family, he was an unchallengeable force, a patriarch whose approval was the ultimate prize. But Amira would never have it. She was the result of a mistake, a lapse in judgment that James Wells had been forced to acknowledge only because it had become public knowledge. Her mother, a woman named Aaliyah, had been nothing more than a fleeting affair, an indiscretion that should have been buried and forgotten. But Aaliyah had given birth to Amira, and while James had no interest in raising a child from his betrayal, the Wells family name carried weight, and a scandal could not be afforded. So Amira had been brought into the Wells household, not out of love or duty, but out of necessity. Her mother had not been given the same luxury. Aaliyah had been quietly paid off, sent away, leaving her daughter to be raised in a house that would never truly be her home. Amira had tried, at first, to fit in. She had sought approval in the only way a child could, through obedience, through good behavior, through academic excellence. She had been smarter than her siblings, more diligent, more eager to prove herself. But none of it had mattered. Her brothers and sister, all white, all perfect reflections of their parents, were celebrated for even the smallest achievements. Amira, no matter what she accomplished, was ignored. Her stepmother, Elizabeth Wells, had been the most direct in her disdain. It was not outright hatred. No, that would have required too much effort. It was worse than that. It was indifference, the kind that cut deeper than cruelty ever could. Elizabeth did not argue with Amira, did not raise her voice, did not engage with her at all. She merely acted as if she did not exist, as if she were an inconvenience best left unacknowledged. Her siblings followed their mother's lead. Andrew, the eldest, carried himself with the same arrogance as their father. He had been groomed from birth to take over the family business, and he treated Amira as though she were a servant rather than a sister. Victoria, poised and elegant, inherited her mother's icy demeanor. She did not speak to Amira unless it was to remind her of her place. Michael, the youngest, was the most openly cruel. He took pleasure in belittling her and making sure she knew she was different. The household staff, though silent, followed the unspoken rule. Amira Wells was not one of them. She was an outsider within her own home. She had learned in time that there was no use in seeking their approval. If her father could not be proud of her, if her mother could not accept her, if her siblings would never see her as family, then she would stop trying. She had hardened herself to their rejection, yet, despite everything, she refused to break. Amira knew she would never inherit the company, never be granted the same privileges as her siblings, never be handed a place in the empire that bore her family's name. But she also knew that she was smarter than all of them. They were entitled, lazy in their security, cushioned by the wealth that had always been theirs. She, on the other hand, had been given nothing. And because of that, she had learned to build something for herself. She spent her time studying, not just her schoolwork, but business, finance, technology. She read everything she could get her hands on, understanding early that knowledge would be her greatest weapon. She learned to listen, to observe, to anticipate. If she could not be part of the Wells dynasty, she would create her own. There were moments, brief as they were, when she allowed herself to wonder what life might have been like if her father had loved her, if her mother had stayed, if she had been born into a different family, one that cherished her instead of merely tolerating her existence. But those were foolish thoughts, and Amira had no use for foolishness. By the time she turned 16, she no longer cared for their approval. She stopped trying to be seen. She stopped sitting at the dinner table, where conversations revolved around successes she would never be included in. She stopped seeking out her father's gaze in the rare moments he addressed her. She stopped responding when Michael mocked her, when Victoria dismissed her, when Andrew pretended she was invisible. She became a ghost in the house that was supposed to be hers. But she was not broken. Not yet. The final fracture came when she turned 18. It was the night of her high school graduation, a moment that should have been celebrated. Her siblings had all received extravagant gifts when they had reached the same milestone. Andrew had been given his first investment portfolio. Victoria had been handed the keys to a luxury apartment. Michael had been gifted a sports car. Amira received nothing, not even a word of congratulations. That night, she overheard her father speaking to Elizabeth in his office. She had not meant to eavesdrop, but when she heard her name, she had paused. "She's finished high school," James had said. "She's no longer my responsibility." Elizabeth had sighed, as if speaking of her was an exhausting burden. "She's going to expect something. What are you going to do?" "I'm not paying for her college," James had said simply. "I've given her more than enough." That was all. A lifetime in that house, a childhood of fighting for a place she would never have, and in the end she was discarded without a second thought. That was the moment Amira Wells made a decision. She would leave. She would never come back, and one day she would make them regret ever turning their backs on her. Amira left the Wells estate on the morning of her 18th birthday, carrying nothing but a single suitcase and the quiet, burning determination that had been smoldering inside her for years. The house had been silent when she walked out. No one had noticed her absence. No one had come to stop her, and certainly no one had wished her well. She had not expected them to. She had no car, no financial cushion, and no connections to rely on. Unlike her siblings, who had the family's wealth at their fingertips, she had been given nothing. The Wells name carried power, but not for her. It had never belonged to her the way it did to them. She knew that even if she used it, it would bring her no favors, only suspicion and dismissal. If she was going to survive, she would do it on her own terms. She took a train to New York City, the place where she knew opportunities thrived, where no one cared about family legacies, only results. It was a far cry from the pristine corridors of her father's estate, from the manicured country clubs and exclusive business circles where her family ruled. Here, the streets were alive with ambition and hunger, a constant hum of movement and urgency that called to something deep inside her. She enrolled in university with a scholarship, knowing it was her only path forward. It was not an Ivy League institution like the ones her siblings attended, not the kind of school her father would have considered worthy of his name. But it was hers, and it was enough. Every day was a battle. While her brothers and sisters spent their college years networking and partying, she worked. In the mornings, she attended lectures, absorbing everything she could about finance, economics, and business. In the afternoons, she took shifts at a small startup, handling menial tasks that no one else wanted to do. In the evenings, she studied until her vision blurred, forcing herself to push past exhaustion. There were nights when she sat alone in her cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake, if it had been foolish to think she could make it on her own, if her father had been right all along, that she was nothing, that she would never amount to anything. But then she would remember the way he had spoken about her, the way her mother had dismissed her, the way her siblings had laughed at her expense, and she would work harder. She had no mentors, no guiding hand to show her the way. What she did have was an unshakable will to prove them wrong. Her first real breakthrough came during her second year of university. She had been interning at a struggling fintech startup, one of many companies fighting to break into the competitive world of digital banking. The company was small, overlooked by the industry's giants, but Amira saw potential where others did not. She noticed the flaws in their business model, the gaps in their strategy that were holding them back. She spent weeks analyzing their operations, staying late after her shifts, poring over reports and financial projections. Then, one day, she took a risk. She walked into the CEO's office, a man who barely knew her name, and presented her findings. She told him exactly what they were doing wrong and exactly how to fix it. He could have dismissed her, he could have laughed in her face, but he didn't. Instead, he listened. Within months, the company turned a profit for the first time. Her ideas had saved them. And for the first time in her life, someone recognized her worth. The CEO offered her a permanent position, but she refused. She had never intended to stay. She had seen what she needed to see, learned what she needed to learn. She had proven to herself that she could make an impact. Now it was time to build something of her own. She spent the next few years crafting her vision. She knew the market. She knew what was missing. She had spent years studying the mistakes of others, learning from them, understanding what separated success from failure. And she was ready. With what little money she had saved, she launched her own company. A small tech firm focused on financial analytics, designed to give individuals the same advantages that only large corporations had access to. It was risky. It was uncertain. It was hers. The first year was brutal. Investors dismissed her, refusing to take her seriously. Competitors tried to crush her before she could even establish herself. She worked day and night, surviving on little more than caffeine and sheer determination. But she did not break. Slowly, her company began to gain traction. People started paying attention. Clients took notice. Then, one day, she received an offer. An investor. Not just any investor, but one with real influence. A man who had been watching her from the sidelines, someone who had seen what she had built and wanted to be part of it. When she met him, she was shocked. It was her grandfather. She had not spoken to him in years. He had never intervened in her life before, had never reached out, had never gone against her father's treatment of her. And yet, here he was. He told her he had been watching, waiting to see what she would do, that he had always known she was different from the rest of the Wells family, that she had something none of them did. She did not know whether to trust him, but she did know one thing. This was an opportunity. She took the investment, and from that moment on, everything changed. With the backing of her grandfather, her company exploded in growth. Suddenly, doors that had been closed to her were open. The people who had once dismissed her were now listening. And then she saw it. The cracks in Wells Enterprises. Her father's company, the empire he had spent his life building, was not as untouchable as he believed. She had studied it for years, understood its weaknesses better than anyone. And she realized something. She could take it. She could do what no one had ever expected. She could take everything from the man who had thrown her away. And so she began her plan. She started buying shares, slowly, quietly, always through intermediaries. She watched as her father and brothers made mistake after mistake, as they relied too much on the illusion of their power, never realizing how vulnerable they had become. And then, when the time was right, she made her move. By the time they saw what was happening, it was too late. She had done the impossible. She had built her own empire, and now she was ready to take theirs. Amira had always hated the Wells family dinners. They were never truly about family, never about warmth or connection. They were performances, carefully choreographed gatherings where her father played the benevolent patriarch, where her siblings basked in the glow of his approval, and where her stepmother orchestrated the illusion of a perfect, untouchable dynasty. For years, Amira had sat at those long, polished tables, listening as they celebrated themselves, ignored her, or, when they felt particularly generous, reminded her of how little she mattered. But this time would be different. She had been waiting for this moment. For years, she had been dismissed as the failure, the disappointment, the child who had amounted to nothing. And they had believed it, because it was easier than seeing the truth. They had never truly looked at her, never questioned why she had disappeared from their world, never wondered what she had been doing all these years. They had assumed, as they always did, that she had faded into irrelevance. They would learn otherwise tonight. The invitation had arrived a week ago, handwritten in elegant script, as if she were just another privileged Wells heir, as if she belonged. It had been a surprise, though not an unwelcome one. Her father never invited her to these things anymore. He had long since decided that she was an embarrassment best left unacknowledged. That meant only one thing. This dinner wasn't just a family affair. It was business. She had smiled when she received it. She knew exactly why he had reached out. The Wells empire was in trouble. She'd seen it coming long before they had. The company that had once been a giant, a seemingly invincible institution, was crumbling under its own weight. Its expansion projects had failed, its investments were bleeding money, and the competition was closing in. But more than that, her father had made the one mistake he had always been too arrogant to consider. He had underestimated her. For months, she had been maneuvering in the shadows, quietly acquiring controlling shares in Wells Enterprises through subsidiaries and strategic partnerships. Piece by piece, she had dismantled their security, exploited their vulnerabilities, and positioned herself for the final move. They had no idea yet, but this dinner would be the beginning of their reckoning. She arrived precisely on time. The Wells estate had not changed. It never did. It remained frozen in time, a monument to old money and rigid traditions. The same towering columns framed the entrance. The same heavy chandeliers illuminated the halls. The same sense of calculated perfection suffocated the air. The staff at the door barely acknowledged her. The butler, a man who had served the Wells family for decades, glanced at her with the same dismissive look he always had, as if surprised that she had dared to return. He took her coat with mechanical politeness and gestured toward the dining hall without a word. Inside, the family was already gathered. Her father sat at the head of the table, as always, his posture impeccable, his expression composed. He had aged since she had last seen him, but his eyes still held the same steely confidence, the same unwavering belief in his own superiority. Elizabeth sat beside him, poised and elegant, the perfect image of the unwavering society wife. Andrew, the golden son, was talking animatedly with a business associate, gesturing with the air of a man who had never known true struggle. Victoria, immaculate as ever, sipped from a glass of wine, scanning the room with a detached boredom that masked her constant hunger for approval. Michael lounged back in his chair, smirking at something one of his friends had said, radiating the arrogance of someone who had never faced consequences. She took her seat, and for a brief moment it was as if nothing had changed. Then her father's voice cut through the air. "You actually came," he said, as if her presence was a mild inconvenience rather than an expected guest. She met his gaze evenly. "You invited me," she said simply. He nodded, as if that were answer enough, and turned his attention back to the conversation at hand. The dinner proceeded as expected. Discussions of business deals, political connections, social events, all carefully constructed to reinforce their own importance. No one asked about her. No one acknowledged her presence beyond the occasional obligatory glance. But she waited. She waited as they boasted about their latest acquisitions. She waited as Andrew spoke at length about his newest investment, a fail-in tech company that he was convinced he could turn around, despite his complete lack of experience or knowledge. She waited as Michael laughed about the latest scandal in their social circle, his voice dripping with privilege and entitlement. She waited as they all continued to exist in their perfectly insulated world, blind to the storm that was about to consume them. Then, finally, it came. Her father leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the table before landing on her. "So," he said, "I hear you started some company." The words were dismissive, designed to diminish, to remind everyone at the table that she was insignificant. Amira smiled. "It's going well," she said. Her father smirked. "Is that so? And what exactly does it do?" There was a time when that question would have made her hesitate, when she would have scrambled to justify herself to prove her worth. But she did not need to prove anything to them anymore. She met his gaze without flinching. "It's a financial analytics firm," she said. "We provide AI-driven investment strategies to independent investors and mid-level firms." Andrew scoffed. "Sounds like a niche market." "It was," she said, "until we disrupted it." Her father's expression didn't change, but she saw the slight narrowing of his eyes, the faint shift in his posture. He was listening now. "We've developed an algorithm that outperforms traditional financial models by a significant margin," she continued. "It's already being adopted by several major firms." Andrew laughed. "So, what? You wrote some code? That's not business, that's a hobby." Amira let the insult slide off her. She didn't need to defend herself, Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a single envelope. She placed it on the table, sliding it forward. Her father's eyes flickered with curiosity before he picked it up. The moment he opened it, the room changed. Silence fell like a hammer. Amira watched as her father's expression darkened, as her stepmother stiffened beside him, as Andrew's smirk faded, as Victoria set down her wineglass with deliberate slowness, as Michael leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Inside that envelope were the documents that outlined the transfer of controlling shares. Her company had acquired the majority stake in Wells Enterprises. She owned them now. Her father looked up, his face unreadable. "What is this?" Her smile didn't falter. "That," she said, "is reality." The air in the room grew heavy. Her father set the papers down carefully, his hands steady, but she could see the fury behind his calm. "You're lying," Andrew said, his voice sharp with disbelief. Amira tilted her head slightly. "You can verify it yourself," she said. Victoria's fingers curled against the tablecloth. Michael's jaw tightened. Her father said nothing. For the first time in her life, he had nothing to say. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She had waited years for this moment. For years, they had looked at her and seen nothing. Now, they had no choice but to see her. And this was only the beginning. The silence stretched long after Amira's words settled over the room, thick and suffocating, like a fog that refused to lift. It was not the silence of contemplation or mild surprise. It was the silence of an empire realizing it had fallen. Her father, for all his ironclad composure, did not speak. He merely sat there, the paper still clutched in his hand, his fingers pressing against the edges with a force that made them tremble ever so slightly. Amira had watched him long enough, studied his every reaction, his every instinct, and she knew exactly what was happening behind those cold, calculating eyes. He was trying to make sense of it. He was cycling through every possibility, every move left on the board. But there were none. Across the table, Victoria had gone stiff, her fingers curled against the stem of her wineglass, her eyes flickering between their father and Amira as though she were watching an elaborate joke unfold. Michael's mouth had parted slightly, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found, his face paling by the second. And Andrew, golden child, heir to the throne, rightful successor to the Wells Empire, looked as though someone had struck him across the face. Elizabeth was the first to speak. Her voice was quiet but sharp, the way glass is sharp when it shatters. "This is ridiculous." She did not look at Amira when she said it, only at James, as if she refused to acknowledge that she was even the one responsible for the shift in power. Elizabeth Wells had spent her life ensuring that their family legacy remained unshaken, that everything fell into place exactly as it should, that every piece of their empire stayed within carefully defined borders. This was not part of the plan. Amira did not move, did not flinch. She had spent years being ignored, erased, pushed to the background, and in some ways it had been a gift. They had never seen her as a threat. That had been their greatest mistake. James exhaled slowly, folding the papers with precision and setting them down on the table in front of him. His eyes lifted, finally meeting hers, and she could see it. The barely concealed rage beneath the surface, the struggle to maintain control. She wondered how it felt to look at someone you had spent your whole life dismissing, only to realize too late that you had created your own undoing. How? It was just one word, spoken low and steady, but it was more than that. It was an admission. It was defeat wrapped in curiosity and a last-ditch effort to understand where he had gone wrong. Amira allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't difficult, she said simply. And it wasn't. Not for her. She had been watching for years. She had seen the cracks before they ever formed, had known exactly where to press, exactly when to strike. While they had been sitting at their gilded tables, basking in their own self-importance, she had been working. Her father had never considered the possibility that his daughter, the one he had so easily discarded, would one day hold the knife to his throat. And yet, here she was. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, taking her time, savoring the moment. "You were too comfortable," she said, "too reliant on your own name. You thought Wells Enterprises was untouchable because it always had been, because no one had ever challenged you before. You underestimated the market. You made bad investments. You kept expanding when you should have been restructuring. You let Andrew make decisions he wasn't qualified to make, and you ignored the warning signs until it was too late." Andrew bristled at that, his hands curling into fists against the table, but he did not interrupt. Amira tilted her head, watching as her father took in every word as he tried to pick apart her explanation, find a flaw, find a way to argue. There was none. She continued. "I've been buying shares for years," she said quietly. "Through investors you didn't think twice about, through people you dismissed as unimportant. And when I needed more, I had help." Her grandfather, the one member of the Wells family who had seen her, who had believed in her, who had understood that she was the only one worthy of carrying the legacy forward. That knowledge, the realization that his own father had sided with her, made James's jaw tighten. Amira almost pitied him. Almost. She sat back in her chair, her expression calm, controlled. "You lost your company, Father," she said. "You just didn't realize it until now." The weight of her words settled over the room like a death sentence. Michael pushed back his chair suddenly, his voice breaking through the silence like a gunshot. "No," he said, shaking his head, his eyes darting between them. This isn't real. She can't." He turned to James, desperate now. "Dad, do something." Amira watched as James finally exhaled, long and slow, his shoulders drawing back. "I assume this dinner was for a reason," he said. His voice was controlled again, composed. If she had not been watching him so closely, she might have believed he was still in control. But she could see the truth now. The fight had already left him. She nodded. "It was," she said. Her father steepled his fingers in front of him, watching her carefully. "What do you want?" Amira considered that for a moment. What did she want? For years she had dreamed of this moment, had thought about what she would say when she finally sat across from him as an equal, or, more accurately, as his superior. She had imagined threats, ultimatums, the pleasure of watching him squirm beneath the weight of her success. But now that she was here, she realized she didn't need any of that. She had already won. She had already proven herself. She didn't need his recognition. She didn't need his respect. She had built something greater than anything he had ever given her, greater than the Wells name itself. So she smiled, slow and deliberate, and she said nothing. Her father's brows furrowed slightly, just the smallest flicker of confusion, the briefest crack in his armor. "I don't need anything from you," she said. "I never did." She pushed back her chair, standing gracefully, smoothing her hands over the fabric of her dress. "Tomorrow morning, the official transition will be announced," she said. "I expect your resignation by then." James said nothing. She glanced around the table once, taking in the faces of the people who had spent their lives looking down on her, who had mocked her, who had erased her. Victoria, who had always prided herself on knowing everything, looked like she had just realized how little she actually understood. Michael, who had laughed at her expense for years, was now frozen in disbelief. Andrew, who had believed he was the rightful heir, was now nothing. And Elizabeth, always composed, always unshakable, had gone silent. Amira met her father's gaze one last time, and then she walked away. She left them sitting there in their perfect, crumbling empire, left them drowning in their own failure. She stepped outside, inhaling the cool night air, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders, feeling the freedom settle into her bones. She had won, and they had lost, and tomorrow the world would know it too. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness as Amira stepped outside the Wells estate, leaving behind the family that had spent years pretending she did not exist. The echoes of the dinner still lingered in her mind. The stunned silence, the quiet horror creeping into their expressions, the slow realization that everything they had built was no longer theirs. The weight of it all should have felt heavy, but instead she felt light. Lighter than she had in years. The night was cool, the air crisp against her skin as she walked toward the waiting car. She had arranged for a driver, knowing she wouldn't want to linger after delivering the final blow. She had no intention of giving them the satisfaction of seeing her revel in their downfall. That was never what this had been about. It had never been about revenge, not in the way they would assume. It had been about proving to herself that she was more than what they had tried to make her. And now she had. As she reached for the car door, she heard footsteps behind her, hurried and heavy. She knew who it was before she even turned. Mason. The brother who had always been the most volatile, the quickest to anger, the first to lash out when things didn't go his way. He had always been the weakest link, the one who relied not on strategy but on brute force and entitlement. She had expected him to be the first to crack. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze as he stormed down the front steps, his face contorted with fury. He was still dressed in the impeccable suit he had worn to dinner, but now it looked wrong on him, like a king who had just been dethroned but refused to acknowledge it. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight as he approached her with the barely restrained aggression that had always defined him. "You think you won?" he spat, his voice low but shaking with rage. "You think you can just walk away after this?" Amira tilted her head slightly, watching him with a calm detachment that always seemed to infuriate him more. Mason had never been able to handle composure. He thrived on chaos, on reactions. He wanted her to yell, to argue, to fight back. He wanted to drag her down to his level because it was the only way he knew how to function. She didn't give him that satisfaction. "I didn't think, Mason," she said smoothly. "I know." His nostrils flared, his entire body vibrating with barely contained anger. "You set us up. You manipulated everything. You made us look like fools." Amira let out a soft, almost amused breath. "I didn't need to," she said. "You did that all on your own." Mason's eyes darkened, his hands twitching at his sides. For a moment, she thought he might actually lunge at her, might finally cross the line he had spent years dancing around. But then a voice cut through the tension, sharp and controlled. "Enough!" Elizabeth. Their mother stood on the steps now, her silhouette framed by the glow of the grand entrance behind her. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the evening had finally settled onto her shoulders. Her face was unreadable, the mask she had perfected over the years still in place, but Amira could see the cracks now. The slight tension in her posture, the way her hands clenched at her sides as if she were trying to keep herself from reaching for something solid. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth looked unsteady. Mason turned toward her, his expression desperate now. "Mom, you're just going to let this happen? She just stole everything from us?" Elizabeth didn't look at him. She didn't even acknowledge his outburst. Her eyes were locked on Amira, unreadable and searching. "Go inside, Mason," she said, her voice soft but firm. Mason stared at her as if she had struck him. "You can't be serious." "Go inside," she repeated, the faintest edge creeping into her tone now. Mason hesitated for a long moment, his entire body vibrating with the need to fight, to push back, to demand that someone, anyone, fix this for him. But then, finally, he exhaled sharply, turned on his heel, and stormed back up the steps. He slammed the front door behind him, and then it was just the two of them. Amira waited. Elizabeth took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. Her face was still composed, still elegant, but there was something in her eyes now that Amira had never seen before. Something raw, something almost uncertain. "You were always stronger than I gave you credit for," she said finally, her voice quiet. Amira studied her carefully, searching for the hidden barb in the words, the backhanded insult, the subtle way she always found to undermine her. But for once, there was none. Just quiet truth. Elizabeth inhaled, as if about to say more, but then stopped herself. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze lingering on Amira for a moment longer before she turned and walked back inside. Amira watched her go, a strange tightness settling in her chest. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected anything from Elizabeth at all, least of all something that resembled respect. The door closed behind her, and the house fell silent once more. Amira turned, finally sliding into the back seat of the car. The driver waited for her instructions. She gave him the address of her apartment, her real home, not the house that had never been hers. As they pulled away from the estate, she let herself exhale fully, feeling the weight of the night begin to fade. The battle was over, but the war was not. The world would wake up tomorrow to headlines that would shake the industry to its core. The golden dynasty of the Wells family had fallen, toppled by the very person they had tried to erase. News outlets would analyze every detail, dissecting how an outsider had managed to outmaneuver one of the most powerful business families in the country. The financial sector would be in chaos, investors scrambling to understand what had happened, companies reevaluating their alliances, and at the center of it all would be her. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the notifications that had already begun flooding in. Investors, business leaders, former colleagues, people who had ignored her for years now clamoring to align themselves with her. The vultures who had once circled her father were now turning toward her, eager to see what came next. But there was only one message she cared about. A single unread text from her grandfather. "Everything is in place." The official announcement goes live at 8 a.m. She smiled. Perfect. The night might have been silent, but the morning would be deafening. She looked out the window as the city lights blurred past, the skyline stretching high above her, a testament to power and ambition. She had fought for this, bled for this, and now it was hers. And she wasn't done yet. The city had already begun to wake by the time Amira arrived at her penthouse. The first streaks of dawn crept across the skyline, bathing the glass and steel towers in a muted glow. The streets below pulsed with the early signs of life. Taxis humming down avenues, street vendors setting up for the morning rush, joggers cutting through the cool air with measured strides. It was a city that never truly slept, only paused before surging forward again. It suited her. She stepped out of the car, nodding briefly to the doorman who greeted her with the polite, professional detachment she preferred. No questions, no pleasantries, just efficiency. She had no patience for anything else tonight. The elevator ride to the top floor was smooth, uninterrupted, giving her a moment of rare solitude. As the doors slid open, she walked into the quiet sanctuary of her home, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. She slipped off her coat, draping it over the back of the sleek leather chair in her living room, and crossed the room to the floor-to-ceiling windows. From here, she could see almost the entire city stretching beneath her, a vast sea of light and ambition. It was hers now, not in the way her father had believed he owned things, not as something inherited, expected, or taken for granted. No, she had carved her place here. She had built her empire, step by step, battle by battle, and now the world would have no choice but to acknowledge it. Her phone vibrated in her palm. She glanced down. The screen was filled with notifications, financial analysts speculating on what this meant for the industry, former doubters now trying to position themselves in her favor, journalists desperate for a statement. She ignored most of them. There was only one thing that mattered right now. She pressed the call button. It barely rang once before her grandfather answered. "They're in shambles," he said without preamble. There was something almost amused in his tone, as though he had been waiting for this moment longer than she had. Nathan and Mason showed up at the office first thing this morning. Security had to escort them out. Amira exhaled slowly, allowing herself the satisfaction of the image. Her father and brother, men who had always carried themselves with unshakable certainty, reduced to pleading their case outside the very building they had once commanded. "They really thought they could stop it," she said. "Nathan was always blinded by arrogance," her grandfather replied. "And Mason, well, he was never equipped for reality." He paused for a moment. "Are you ready for today?" More than ever. She could hear it already, the murmurs, the shifting tides. By the time she stepped into Wells Enterprises, she would no longer be an outsider. She would be the center of gravity, the force they all had to reckon with. She ended the call, taking a slow, measured breath before turning away from the window. The morning was here. It was time. By the time she arrived at the Wells headquarters, the building was already alive with speculation. Clusters of employees murmured in hushed tones, exchanging glances as she passed. Some with curiosity, some with apprehension, some with outright fear. They had heard the news, of course. It had been impossible to ignore. The fall of a dynasty was not something that happened quietly. She entered the elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. The ride up was silent, her reflection in the mirrored walls calm and composed. There was no hesitation in her stance, no uncertainty in her gaze. When the doors slid open, the boardroom was already filled. Every member of the executive team was present, seated in their polished leather chairs around the massive glass table. Some looked wary, others defiant, but none of them spoke as she entered. They had expected her father. They had expected business as usual. But business had changed. She took her seat at the head of the table, the same seat her father had occupied for decades, the seat she had never been allowed to approach. It was hers now. She let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "We're here to discuss the transition of power," she said evenly, her voice carrying through the room without strain, without hesitation. "As you all know, the company has undergone restructuring. Effective immediately, I'll be assuming the position of CEO." A ripple of movement spread across the table, uncertain glances, the faintest tightening of jaws, then a single voice. "That's not happening." Her father. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze as he leaned forward from his position at the far end of the table. He looked composed, but she could see it now, the cracks beneath the surface, the forced steadiness in his expression, the way his fingers curled just slightly against the table's edge. "This is still my company," he said, quieter this time but no less sharp. Amira didn't blink. "Check the legal documents," she said. "Your shares were sold. You hold nothing." She watched the impact of her words settle into him, the slow realization that this was real, that there was no maneuver left, no escape. His eyes darkened. He forced a smirk, but it was hollow now. "You think you can run this place?" he asked. "You have no experience at this level." Amira leaned forward, her fingers pressing against the cool surface of the table. "And yet," she said, "my independent business has been more profitable in the last 3 years than this company has been under your leadership. You let Mason drive it into the ground while you were too blind to see it." Mason let out a sharp exhale, his face red with anger. "You little—" The sharp voice of their grandfather cut through the tension like a blade. "Sit down, Mason." Mason's mouth snapped shut, his fists clenching at his sides. Amira took advantage of the silence. "Let me make one thing clear," she said. "I am not my father. I don't run businesses through nepotism and arrogance. I earned my place here. And if anyone in this room doesn't believe in my leadership, you're welcome to resign." No one moved. Not one board member, not even the ones who had doubted her. Her father exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as he finally began to understand. "You really did it," he muttered, his voice hoarse now, the confidence cracking. "You really took everything." Amira met his gaze head-on. "No, Dad," she said, "you lost everything. I just stopped letting you hold me back." For the first time in her life, he had no response. The meeting concluded in absolute silence. No protests, no resistance. It was done. As she left the boardroom, she walked past her father and brother without another glance. Security had already been informed. They would not be permitted back inside. They were nothing now. She stepped into her new office, taking a slow breath as she surveyed the space. The city stretched out before her, vast and endless. This was her future now, her empire. And for the first time in her life, she had won. The morning after the takeover, the world woke up to chaos. The headlines were everywhere, flooding financial news networks, dominating the front pages of major business journals and spreading like wildfire across social media. Every platform, every channel, every analyst had one story on their lips: the fall of the Wells dynasty. The name that had once been synonymous with untouchable wealth and power was now plastered across the screens of millions, but for all the wrong reasons. The empire had been dismantled, not by a corporate rival, not by financial collapse, but by the very woman they had spent years trying to erase. Amira watched it unfold in real time. She sat in her office, the one that had once belonged to her father, her hands resting on the sleek glass desk as she scanned the flood of articles pouring in. The underdog who outplayed the titans. Amira Wells takes control of family empire. Silent power shift. How a rejected heiress staged the perfect corporate takeover. From outcast to CEO, the woman who beat the Wells dynasty at their own game. Every word felt like the final stroke in a masterpiece she had spent years crafting. She sipped her coffee slowly, her face unreadable, but inside something burned. A quiet, victorious satisfaction. This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving herself to the world. She had never cared about their approval. This was about cementing her place, making it undeniable. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Calls, messages, emails. Some were from people who had dismissed her before, now eager to attach themselves to her success. Investors who had once ignored her pitches were suddenly interested in collaborating. Executives who had once refused to meet with her now wanted to schedule urgent calls. The very same journalists who had overlooked her achievements were now desperate for an exclusive interview. She ignored most of them. Then a call came through that made her pause. Her grandfather. She answered immediately, her voice calm. "They're scrambling," he said, wasting no time with pleasantries. His tone held something close to amusement. "Your father and Mason showed up at the office first thing this morning, trying to talk to the board. Security had to remove them." She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "They thought they could still fix it." "They're desperate," her grandfather said. "Your father's trying to convince the shareholders that this is temporary, that he can take it back." He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something sharper in his tone. "He still doesn't believe it's over." Amira felt a flicker of something cold move through her. Of course, he didn't. Nathan Wells had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. The idea that someone, she, could take everything from him was something his mind simply could not comprehend. He would fight. He would scheme. He would try to manipulate, to twist, to reclaim what had been lost. But he would fail, because he had never understood her. He had spent his life believing she was weak, insignificant, nothing more than an inconvenience. And that blindness had cost him everything. She ended the call with her grandfather, her mind already shifting to the next step. Because this wasn't just about taking control. This was about keeping it. The company was hers now, but it was still fragile. There were still board members who had been loyal to her father, still investors who were wary of the transition, still employees who had spent years under the Wells regime and would struggle to accept a new ruler. She had won the battle, but the war for true control had only just begun. And she knew her father would not go down quietly. She spent the rest of the morning in meetings, reviewing reports, speaking with key executives. There was no room for hesitation. She had to move fast, had to establish herself as the authority before anyone could challenge her. By noon, she had already made 3 major decisions. The first, an internal audit of all ongoing projects, cutting wasteful expenditures and redirecting resources toward innovation. The second, a restructuring of the leadership team, ensuring that those who had been too comfortable under her father's rule were either removed or made to prove their worth. And the third, a full public statement. She could not let the media control the narrative. If she was going to redefine the Wells empire, she had to be the one to set the tone. By early afternoon, the press release was ready. It was direct, unapologetic. Wells Enterprises has entered a new era. Under new leadership, we are committed to innovation, integrity, and strategic growth. We recognize the legacy of this company, but we are focused on the future. And that future begins now. There was no mention of her father, no acknowledgement of the turmoil, no need for explanations or justifications. She was not here to dwell on the past. She was here to lead. The statement was released at precisely 3 p.m. Within minutes, the response was overwhelming. Some praised her decisiveness. Some questioned whether she had the experience to handle the weight of the company. Some outright hated that she had taken control. But all of them were talking about her. and that meant she had already won the first battle. By evening, she knew she had changed the course of the company forever. But as she sat in her office, the city lights glowing outside her window, she knew there was still one thing left to face: her father. Because if she knew anything about Nathan Wells, it was that he would not go quietly into the shadows, and she would be ready. The office had never been so silent. Amira sat at the head of the massive conference table, the same one where her father had once presided over meetings with absolute authority. The room was still, thick with an unspoken tension that stretched between her and the man sitting at the far end. Nathan Wells, her father. The man who had spent his entire life shaping this company in his own image, the man who had believed himself invincible. The man who, for years, had ignored her existence, had pretended she was nothing more than a stain on his legacy. And now, he was sitting across from her in a chair that no longer belonged to him, in a room that was no longer his to command. The irony was almost poetic. Nathan was composed, as he always was. He sat upright, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. But Amira could see the signs, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed against the table before curling back into his palm, the glint of something dark and furious behind his eyes. She had spent her entire life watching him, learning from him, understanding the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he controlled everything around him. And now, for the first time, she saw something she had never seen before: defeat. Not acceptance. Not surrender. But the quiet, seething realization that he had lost. He had lost everything, and Amira had taken it. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them stretched, heavy and absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside, the distant murmur of traffic below. Finally, Nathan exhaled, slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady. "You think this is over?" Amira didn't react. She had expected this. "You think you've won?" he continued, his eyes locked onto hers. "You think taking my company means you've beaten me?" She let the words settle for a moment before speaking. "This was never about beating you," she said evenly. His lips curled slightly, a mockery of a smile. "No? Then what was it about?" She tilted her head slightly, watching him, studying him. "It was about taking what was mine." Nathan let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. "You don't belong here." She didn't flinch. "You never did," he continued. "You're an outsider. No matter what title you hold, no matter what the press says, you will never be one of us." Amira leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. "That's where you're wrong," she said softly. "I was never one of you, and that's exactly why I won." His expression flickered just for a second, a crack in the armor. "You built this company on entitlement," she said, "on nepotism, on a name. You thought that was enough, that no one could challenge you because no one ever had. You thought the world revolved around you because that's all you've ever known. But the world changed. Business changed. And you never saw it coming." Nathan's fingers curled against the table, his knuckles white. "You let Mason run this place into the ground," she continued, "because he had the right bloodline, because he fit the image, because he was everything you wanted in a son. But he was weak, he was reckless, and while you were too busy propping him up, I was building something real." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Amira sat back, her expression calm, controlled. "This company isn't yours anymore," she said. "It never will be again." Silence. Nathan exhaled through his nose, his gaze sharp, unreadable. Then, slowly, He pushed back his chair, rising to his feet with a deliberate slowness. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the table, the windows overlooking the city. The empire he had built, the empire he had lost. Then he looked back at her. "You think this is your victory," he said, "but you don't know what real power is. You don't know what it takes to hold it." Amira didn't move. "Enjoy this while it lasts," he murmured, "because it won't." And with that, he turned and walked out. She didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done. She knew what she had won. And she knew with absolute certainty that she was never letting it go. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's next. Watch more videos to stay ahead. Share this video with others who need to see it.